Imagine you could go back in time and meet your distant ancestors. Would you share traits with them? Would you have the same eye color? Would you be able to see part of yourself in one of your ancestors?
Genetics is starting to be able to answer some of those questions for us. If we can take the DNA of living people and combine that with genealogical information, would we be able to actually get a complete picture of what our ancestors were like?
The AncestryDNA team is excited to say the answer is yes. We've reached a milestone in the development of a method to reconstruct the genome of a distant human ancestor from the genetic material of living descendants. This means you don't need to go get hair from your second great-grandmother's hairbrush or dig out baby teeth from somebody's jewelry box. Instead, we can use statistics and computer science to start stitching together pieces of DNA from our ancestors.
Identifying the pieces of the genome that you and your relatives inherited from particular ancestors can give you a more complete picture of those ancestors.
Since AncestryDNA launched in May of 2012, we've genotyped more than 500,000 customers. Using all this genetic information, as well as their pedigrees, we've identified an individual who's a great person to use to test our methods for reconstructing ancestral genomes.
Mr. David Spiegel is a particularly interesting person to look at because he had a lot of kids, who each had a lot of kids, which means he has a lot of descendants who potentially are among our AncestryDNA customer base. David Spiegel was actually married twice, so here we're going to be talking about the DNA that David Spiegel and his two wives passed on to their descendants. Piecing together an ancestor's genome can reveal many things. In our case, we found that David Spiegel or one of his wives had a version of the gene that makes you more likely to have male pattern baldness. Of course, this is something that's more relevant for the sons of David Spiegel than his daughters. We also found that David Spiegel and one of his wives had a version of the gene that you need in order to have blue eyes.
These are just examples of what we can find out about people who lived hundreds of years ago. By mining the DNA data of David's descendants, we're able to complete a picture of what he might have been like. Collecting and mining these data required us to bring together science and history and statistics on a scale that we've not done before.
We used two different methods to identify pieces of the genome belonging to David Spiegel and his wives. But first, let's dig a little deeper and learn about how we started.
First, we constructed genetic networks of David Spiegel's descendants. You know how you have a social network where you're linked together with people you know or your co-workers? Well, instead we made a genetic network based on people who share DNA with each other and are also descended from David Spiegel according to their family trees. And then we went one step further and we had professional genealogists vet those family trees so we knew that we were basing our research on a truth set. The first method we want to talk about is based on the principle that if two people are related, they share a piece of DNA from a common ancestor. If we know who that common ancestor is, we can then attribute that segment of DNA to that common ancestor.
So we started with a set of pairs of people who all had David Spiegel or one of his wives as their most recent common ancestor. So then, given these shared pieces of DNA, we could then stitch these segments together to get long pieces of DNA that we think represented parts of the genome of David Spiegel or one of his wives. The second method we explored was actually first developed for research into livestock genetics. The method requires a family tree linking all individuals for whom we have genetic data, and then tries to infer what parts of the genome were transmitted throughout the whole pedigree. Then we can use that information to try to determine what pieces of the genome came from either David Spiegel or one of his wives.
Using these two different methods, we were able to obtain complementary and analogous results, so that as we walk across the human genome, at least 50% of the time, we're able to find a segment of DNA that we can attribute to David Spiegel or one of his wives.
Having more descendants means that we could potentially have more of the genome of a particular ancestor represented. For example, we were able to get up to that 50% number that Kathy cited from an original 36% just by adding a handful of descendants.
While mining genetic data to reassemble the genome of a distant ancestor is a complex process, it's an exciting one. While the implications for genetic genealogy are straightforward, there may even be applications for medical genetics and population genetics as well.
So while we're still refining our methods for piecing together the genomes of our distant ancestors, combining DNA data with genealogical information is something that everyone can take advantage of today, just through a simple test of your saliva.
And while your test might not result in the reconstruction of your ancestor's genome, it will take you one step closer to understanding where you came from and perhaps even helping you visualize who your distant ancestors were.